And I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the First Nations of this part of the world. So the topic today is turning point, but really when it was presented to me, I didn't want to talk about me. I want to talk about this plant and the turning point that this plant and our species is in the middle of with that. And so I feel, to understand turning point, we need to know where you're coming from. And in order to understand where cannabis is coming from, we need to look to THC, some of the chemicals in it, because they appeared before the plant itself. In fact, we look back 500 million years ago to the beginning of life in many ways on this planet. And so the first THC appeared in what we call sea squirts. These, basically these little like sea stars that lived on the floor of the oceans. And so the first use of THC is still being used amongst us and every vertebrate animal in the world today in our nervous systems. And so the way it works is actually quite simple. Our nerves are these long strands of fiber through our body, and they send chemicals to each other to communicate. And I love using the analogy of playing rugby and hitting my knee, which I did a lot. And so when you hit your knee, your nerves send drug back and forth to communicate to your brain that there's a problem. Your brain actually sends an anandamide, which is THC exactly, from one nerve down to the next to tell the original sore point that we got the message. And the way it works is that the THC fits into your nerve receptor like a ball into a glove. It's magic. And the same chemical that is produced in the plant that we call THC, we call anandamide, because we actually produce THC as well. We are a cousin of the cannabis plant. And ironically, 500 million years ago, that sea squirt sort of branched off into two areas. One that walked around the world and became the vertebrate animals we know today, and the other became a plant that we know now as cannabis sativa. And that plant developed a number of chemicals, terpenes, essential oils that we don't actually produce, that are extremely beneficial for us. And if you look at the interactions of the cannabinoids like THC and the terpenes and the human body, you'll find this amazing endocannabinoid system, we've called it, because our bodies basically use THC and these chemicals to maintain homeostasis and to be healthy and live longer. And so that plant has become the most valuable, important plant in the world. And it's been that way for a long time. In fact, we look back at the earliest human laws, we find that some of them were to control the use of this plant and to keep it to the wealthy. And so the story of this plant is actually interplayed with the story of the industrial military complex that we see dominating this planet now. Because the first rules about cannabis were to keep it to the rich. And in fact, Moses, when he was told to make the anointing oil, which contains 7 pounds of cannabis in the recipe, was told that he could use this secret anointing oil to heal, but it was to be kept to the priesthood, that the lower class and the middle class, they weren't allowed to be using that because they weren't sacred enough. So when Jesus came along and started to use that sacred anointing oil to heal the lepers and other people, because it's an antibiotic, antifungal, antiseptic, there's a number of properties that are very beneficial to the skin, he was condemned for that because he was not doing what the wealthy and the privileged wanted him to do, freely sharing their secrets. And so the church, the Judeo-Christian sort of cultural shelter that dominated Western society, did a very good job of suppressing plant medicines in general. Not just the cannabis plant was told it was not used for healing, but pretty much any practice that used plant medicines was suppressed. And it was pretty much left to God to heal for a long time there. But that did not stop cannabis from being used, quite the opposite, because cannabis has got so many incredible uses. So we started to use the seed a lot for food because hemp contains all the essential fatty acids in the seed oil that you need to sustain life. It's incredibly beneficial food. But we also started to learn to make things from the fiber. So the hemp stalk, if you grow the plant, you have fiber on the outside and a cork, like a woody pith on the middle. Well, that fiber is incredibly useful. All the clothing pretty much I'm wearing today is made out of it. The first Bibles were printed on hemp paper, on the fiber of that paper. And in fact, canvas, the root word is cannabis. So all the sailing ships that brought Europeans over to America had tons of cannabis hemp on the ships, on the sailing cloths, on the rope, and the clothing of people there. And it was an incredibly huge part of settling North America, with the canvas wagons, and hemp in Kentucky was a massive economy in the 1800s. And so everything was going great until around 1916, when that cork, that woody pith, could suddenly be made into paper. And there was processing equipment made that could process hemp from the field that much faster. So suddenly farmers could grow a very valuable plant to them that they could sell for multiple purposes. But that didn't work too well for the military-industrial complex that at the time was working really hard to take everything they could away from farmers, essentially, in the natural world and exploit it to the max. And so along comes Andrew Mellon, the richest man in America, who founded companies like DuPont Chemical, Imperial Oil. He was the richest man in America when he became the Secretary-Treasurer. He colluded with people like William Hearst, who invented the term marijuana to convince people there's this new Mexican drug that you had to worry about because it's going to make the black people rape your white girls. So we got to get rid of this nasty new drug. And the Reefer Madness campaign took hold as these very rich corporate interests took hemp quietly out of the marketplace, so that the American Medical Association was one of the few that opposed it in 1937 when these prohibition laws came in. But that didn't stop it, and hemp and marijuana were virtually eliminated from our society until some brave men like Jack Hare came around. He wrote the book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. He exposed the Reefer Madness conspiracy, taught us about the ancient and historical uses of cannabis and hemp, and how these were all very important to us in the past, but had been recently just kind of brushed aside so that these other corporations could sell their synthetic plastic, materials and polyester and all this other stuff that was making these people very rich, but was taking a lot of power away from farmers and giving us substandard products to eat and to wear. And so Jack Hare really, beat the drum along with many other people and paved the way for people like me to come along. And it was 1995 that I first learned about this and decided to write the story of cannabis, because I thought when people learned about it that it would become free. And so it's been an incredible journey since then. But one of the first things that happened to me when I began to write this book was I began to meet sick people. And I met a lady that made cookies and brownies and helped AIDS patients. And I saw how people could turn their lives around by just simply eating cannabis cookies. And that blew me away. So at that point, we colluded. We formed the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club in January '96. And we started to sell as much medicine as we could to the sick and poor of Victoria. And so one of the members that I got to meet and to know and to love was Gail Quinn. She came into our store in 2003, and it was not long before we were together. And Gail taught us a tremendous amount about the healing potential of this plant and the plant world in general. So we started to combine some of our salves and massage oils using different herbs. We began to experiment more into making the edible plant medicines with cannabis, and really get into that end of things. And she taught us so much more than that. Gail got cancer. 2011, she lost her breast. And a few years later, it got into her back. Her spine at one point collapsed with the cancer eating it away. She was in the hospital. The morphine and Dilaudid and other drugs weren't managing things very well. We thought that she was going to die. She couldn't eat anything. At that point, we started to get her cannabis suppositories. They really hadn't even been available commercially before that. But that was the only way that we could get cannabis into her. And as soon as those suppositories hit her system, she calmed down enough that she could eat a grape at a time. And with those grapes, we got down cannabis oil, some of the highest concentrations of oil that we could find. And that kept her alive for 2 more years from the very brink of death. And my experience with Gail has only driven me further to provide these medicines to people in palliative care and the most sick and vulnerable and desperate that can't afford these medicines. and I've done everything in my power to help in that direction. And ironically, while Gail was struggling for her life, we were fighting the law on many levels. 10 years ago this week, actually, our bakery was raided in downtown Victoria. My employee, Owen Smith, was charged. We fought that case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Gail was one of the 4 members of our club that testified. And in 2015, while she was literally laying on her deathbed, we saw a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court of Canada that made cannabis extracts and edibles legal for this entire country. And it was a pivotal point. Thank you. It was a pivotal point in not only our lives, but the lives of many Canadians as cannabis became available in these alternative forms. And it changed the medical community's understanding and really was one of the final straws in Bay Street deciding, okay, maybe we should be cashing in on this. And so the Liberal Party of Canada, within months of our Supreme Court decision, picked up legalization as part of their platforms. A few months later, they became elected, and cannabis is now legal in Canada. But I'm embarrassed to say that we have done the worst possible job in legalizing that I could imagine. It's been absolutely dismal on almost every single level. And for patients in particular, the way cannabis has been legalized has really been a step backwards in so many ways that I could just spend an entire TED Talks just on that point alone. But the fact is that legalization's been a nightmare all the way around, not just for patients, not just for a grassroots industry, but it's been essentially a corporate takeover in a way. And the Liberal Party of Canada has decided that all of us formally involved in the industry are like illegal organized criminals that they want to replace with large companies. These large companies, though, haven't really done the best job in the world. And in many ways, not only is the quality and quantity of their product questionable at times, or I should say the quality and the price, but what they've done in the stock exchange has also been another sign of how the rich have continually manipulated the systems in place to take money and power away from the poor and the middle class. In the last 6 months alone, $33 billion in value in these new companies, these licensed producers as they call, has been lost because the entrepreneurs and people that set these up and put them on the stock market hypervaluated them so that people would buy in and spend their hard-earned money buying shares in this new legal cannabis scheme, only to find out that they were just completely overvalued, that their money's pretty much gone, that they're worth a fraction of what they paid for. And this $33 billion has disappeared from the middle class into the hands of the entrepreneurs and the wealthy that set it up in the first place. And so it's just sad to see how so many people have been basically screwed by legalization. But and just 2 weeks ago, actually, our dispensary, the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club, was in fact raided by the Community Safety Unit, they call them. And we will be fighting to the bitter end with that. But our story will not end with just our club, because there's so much more happening on a global scale that it's phenomenal. We are at the most magical turning point possible in, I think, any field of human activity. And I think it's really important when we look at the future now, what we do. We have an opportunity now to re-embrace the natural world, to re-embrace plant medicines, to think outside of the box. And if we don't do that, and don't do that responsibly, then we're going to be ending up with just another commodity in this military-industrial complex where we're just railroaded out of existence. But I don't think that's going to happen for a few reasons. For one, cannabis is becoming legal around the world. All these big companies in Canada thinking they're making millions of dollars are going to go bankrupt pretty quickly, because cannabis can be grown much cheaper and more economically in pretty much every third world country in the world. There's going to be very few people left growing cannabis in Canada in the next 5-10 years, because it's going to be outsourced. There'll be some small craft growers producing like a fine wine, but really I predict that 90% of the cannabis being used in this country in a few years will come from other sources, like most of our food seems to, unless we fight back. And so I think it's fascinating how social media has been a critical component in the legalization of cannabis and in the communities that have built up around it. And I think that cannabis is magic not only because of what it can do to us individually because of what it can do with us collectively. And it's a beautiful plant to gather around and to use. And I've met and fell in love with so many incredible people working in this field. And I think that that will continue on as cannabis becomes more legal and as we actually start to allow lounges to occur and people can start to congregate more in cannabis-friendly locations and have, you know, different types of events and cannabis tourism and things. There's so much that's going to happen here, you know, through social media and community that it's really hard to predict. But what I can tell you is that cannabis is a gateway drug to alternative medicine. Cannabis is a gateway to alternative ways of thinking. It is not what we have been told historically. It is the most magical plant that we could possibly have. Cannabis may not save the world, but it is the only plant that can. And it will only happen if we do it. And we do it responsibly, not the way our government's done now, which is why we have to stand up and change that. But through my life, I have experienced so much joy, so much community, so much healing through this cannabis plant that I have fundamental faith that in the long run, we will do what's right. And that one way or another, we will come to a place where people can freely grow and use their cannabis without the fear of the law, without the fear of the stigma that is still attached to it despite legalization. And I look forward to the day where we can use medicines that, you know, because now it's like the science is fantastic. These essential oils I talked about, we're learning more about them. We can actually target specific types of cancer with these essential oils. We'll be able to grow plants and get people to grow plants in their backyard that are specific to help fight their cancer or their mom's cancer. You know, when we're learning to map the DNA of humans, we're doing the same with the cannabis plant, and we'll be able to find, you know, these perfect matches of medicine and people in a way that will make what we're doing now look very primitive. But what we are doing now at our club isn't primitive. What we're doing is magic, and it's the cutting edge of this work. And I'm just extremely you know, proud to be in this time, and it's an intense turning point, having the authorities trying to shut us down after decades of providing this medicine. But I can assure you that those behind me and myself will never quit until we see this plant reach its rightful place in society. Thank you.